After that, the real Mrs. Pearson tells the real Mrs. Fitzgerald that it is enough. She knows that her family is in trouble and she can't stand that fact. So they should change back and get into their true selves. But the real Mrs. Fitzgerald wanted to continue some more time and give them some more lesson so that they all learn how to regard their mother. She also tells her that a lot of progress has been made already and there is a little bit change in all of them, but a little more effort would do wonders. But the real Mrs. Pearson stays on her opinion and wants to switch back immediately. At last, the real Mrs. Fitzgerald agrees. Mrs. Fitzgerald and Mrs. Pearson change back into their original selves. They both carry out the same action as before. Once again, they both sit and hold hand, and the two women stare at each other. The real Mrs. Fitzgerald utters the same magical spell, and then for some time they become legs, exactly as before. Legs means their bodies become slightly relaxed and they again gain life. And finally, they change back to their original personality. After that, the real Mrs. Fitzgerald says that she enjoyed the experience as she has been able to improve the behavior of Doris, Cyril, and Mrs. Pearson. But Mrs. Pearson says that it was not an pleasant experience for her, as she did not want to see her family members feel miserable. Mrs. Fitzgerald gives Mrs. Pearson a piece of advice and tells her to be strict with family members and tells her not to be lenient and soft towards the members of her family as she used to be earlier. If she does not remain firm and resolute, all their effort to change her family will go waste. She wants her to remain firm. Mrs. Fitzgerald wishes to have some more time and they would have really realized the mistakes they have been doing. Mrs. Pearson replies that she will try her best to remain firm. Mrs. Pearson feels that they are all changed now and they will be doing better. Mrs. Fitzgerald warns her not to give any apology or explanation of what happened, otherwise, they will again start treating her differently and she will be straight back where she was. She must wear a tough look if she wanted them to behave in the right manner and talk to them rudely once in a while, which would keep them on track and understand the importance of her. She also says that Mrs. Pearson can even test this if she wants. Mrs. Fitzgerald asks her to name one thing the family members are reluctant to do, but Mrs. Pearson wants them to do. For example, staying at home once in a while. Mrs. Pearson expressed her desire that the family members should help her with the supper, the night meal. She further asks if there is anything Mrs. Pearson likes to do, irrespective of whatever they like doing it or not. Mrs. Pearson, with a hesitation, reveals her wish to play a game of rummy, but she only gets to play it at Christmas. Mrs. Fitzgerald moves towards the door and she again tells Mrs. Pearson to be firm. Mrs. Fitzgerald opens the door and calls everybody inside. She again reminds Mrs. Pearson quietly to remain firm. All the family members, Doris, Cyril, and Mr. Pearson enters into the house and look apprehensively, means feeling worried about something, at Mrs. Pearson. They don't know how the mother is going to behave this time. For a change, when Annie replies, when Annie smiles, her family members smile back and feel very relieved. While leaving, Mrs. Fitzgerald reminds Mrs. Pearson again to remain firm and never be apologetic. Mrs. Pearson nods in an attempt to show that she remembers whatever Mrs. Fitzgerald has told her. As the family members had cancelled their going out, Mrs. Pearson feels that all, as a family, should play a game of rummy, and she also wants her children to prepare supper for the family so that she can talk with George, her husband. Mrs. Pearson asks her family firmly if they have any objection. George very humbly agrees to whatever Mrs. Pearson wishes them to do. Cyril also quickly replies, "Yes, that's all right." Doris hesitates a bit. Mrs. Pearson sharply asks Doris, "What? Speak up." She wants to tell what is your opinion. Better speak up. So she becomes very stern when she sees Doris is hesitating a little bit. Seeing her mother's stern behavior, Doris readily agrees to do whatever the mother has said and tells her mother that it would be lovely. Mrs. Pearson smiles at Mrs. Fitzgerald, wishing her good-bye, and asks her to visit again soon. Mrs. Fitzgerald, while leaving, wishes everyone good night and also wishes them all to have a nice time. Mrs. Fitzgerald exits left, and the family cluster around, means they all gather around their mother and the curtains fall. The play ends with a happy note where the children and husband are willing to do whatever Mrs. Annie Pearson suggests. Mrs. Pearson, the protagonist, finally has her day when her husband and children realize their mistakes and rediscovers the joy of being a fulfilled mother. She gets the respect and honor that she always deserves as an important status in the family. The play is J.B. Priestley's earnest appeal for a better and human treatment of all mothers. The family members must realize the importance of a household lady of her own house. In order to give wives the praise they deserve, the family needs to give them the desired attention.